On the 3rd of June 2012, a man named Kurt Maddox stood at the edge of a wheat field in Kestrel County, Colorado, and told a woman that her seed belonged in a drawer. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. He has delivered 100 times certain and a little sorry. He said the variety she was planting had been bred out of fashion for 60 years, that it yielded a third less than what the rest of the county was drilling in, and that no elevator within 90 miles would pay a premium for a wheat nobody asked for anymore. He called it a keepsake. He said a keepsake was a fine thing to have and a poor thing to farm. The woman's name was Rilla Hawkins. She was 47 that summer, lean and sun-browned, with her grandmother's seed in a coffee can in her kitchen and her grandmother's stubbornness in her jaw. She listened to all of it. Then she said one thing back, and it was not an argument. She said, "Wait for a dry year." He smiled at that. He had a tablet under his arm and a company truck idling on the section road, and the country behind him for 40 miles was already going over to the new hybrid, a tall, uniform variety called Prairie Gold 9, that the seed company swore would carry the high plains into the next century. He told her gently that dry years came, and the new wheat was bred for them too. Then he got in his truck and drove off, and the dust hung in the air a long time after he was gone, because that part of Colorado was already drier than it should have been in June. Let me tell you about the woman who waited. Rilla Hawkins farmed 800 acres of dryland ground 12 miles north of a town called Sorrel Buttes in the high short grass country where the rain came when it came and not when you wanted it. Dryland means no irrigation. It means you farm the sky. Out there, a person could do everything right, plow straight and drill clean and pray honest, and still watch a whole crop burn off in a single week of 100-degree wind. Her people had farmed that exact ground since 1909, when her great-grandmother stepped off a train at a siding that no longer existed and proved up a homestead nobody else wanted, because the well came in shallow and the ground was thin. Two things had settled her reputation in that county. The first was her quiet, the kind that people sometimes mistook for slow until they tried to put something past her. The second was her wheat. It was a wheat called Turkey Red, a hard red winter variety, brought to the American plains in the 1872 by Mennonite families out of the Russian steppe, who carried it across an ocean in their luggage because they knew it. It was a landrace, which is a plain word for a crop that has never been locked into a single uniform type, that carries a whole crowd of slight differences inside one field, tall plants and short, early heads and late deep roots and shallow. A modern variety is a single plant copied 1,000,000 times. A landrace is a committee. And a committee, Rilla's grandmother had told her, never all dies on the same day. Her grandmother had kept that seed alive through the dust years when the topsoil of 3 counties lifted off the ground and went to Kansas on the wind. She had kept it through the drought of 1954 and the drought of 1977. She had held back a portion of every harvest, the cleanest and the heaviest heads, hand-threshed into the same coffee can that sat now on Rilla's kitchen windowsill. And she had told Rilla just once, near the end, that the seed was not hers and not Rilla's either. It was only passing through their hands. Their job was to hand it on still alive. Rilla had been 9, the first time she was shown how it was done. Her grandmother had set her at the kitchen table in the cool after threshing with a flat pan and a coffee can and a kerosene lamp, and she had poured a double handful of new wheat onto the pan and pushed it across to the girl and said, "Pick the heavy ones. Not the prettiest, the heavy ones. A heavy kernel meant a plant that had finished its grain even in a year that ran short. And a year that runs short is the only kind worth breeding for, because the easy years breed for nothing. They had sat there a long while, the two of them, the girl rolling kernels under her thumb and learning the difference between a kernel that has filled and a kernel that has merely grown, and her grandmother saying almost nothing, only now and then reaching over to set one back that did not belong. That was the whole of the schooling. It took an hour, a year, and 100 years to matter. Her grandmother had said the four words to her for the first time that same evening, when the girl asked why they bothered, when the neighbors all bought their seed clean in a sack from town. The old woman had tapped the side of the can with one finger and looked out the dark window toward the field. She could not see and could have walked blind. "Wait for a dry year," she had said. That was all. The girl had not understood it then. She had spent the next 38 years coming to understand it, kernel by kernel, until it stopped being something her grandmother said and became something she knew in the same place she knew her own name. To the seed company, that wheat was an inefficiency. To Rilla, it was an inheritance she had sworn not to be the one to drop. By 2012, she was nearly the last of the 40-some operations in the northern half of Kestrel County. All but a handful had gone over to Prairie Gold 9, and most of the holdouts were old men who would convert the day they retired. The new hybrid was a genuine marvel, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. In a normal year, it made close to 50 bushels to the acre on dryland ground, where the old wheat struggled to reach 30. It stood up straight for the combine. It headed out 2 weeks early, which let a farmer dodge the worst of the August heat. The company that bred it, Vanter Seed, was not a band of liars. They had run the trials. The numbers were real. The numbers were just not the whole story, and the part they left out was the part that only showed up in the years nobody plans for. Kurt Maddox was the man Vanter sent to win Kestrel County, and you should understand that he was good at his work and believed every word of it. He was 53, a former extension agent with a master's degree in agronomy from a land-grant university, and he had spent 30 years watching tradition lose to data and concluding reasonably that data deserved to win. He was not a bad man. He was a man whose model had never failed in front of him. When he looked at Rilla's field of mixed-height heirloom wheat, he did not see 800 acres of patient genetic insurance. He saw a yield gap. He saw a woman costing herself 20 bushels an acre out of sentiment, and it genuinely pained him the way waste pains a tidy man. So he did what a sincere believer does. He went to work to correct her. He started with the cooperative. The Kestrel County Grain Co-op pooled its members' wheat, blended it, and marketed it as one uniform lot, and a uniform lot fetched a better basis at the terminal than a mixed one. Maddox sat in the co-op's annual meeting in the winter of 2013 and made the case, with charts, that off-type heirloom grain in the pool was dragging down the test weight and the falling number, which is a measure of how sprout-damaged a wheat is and costing every member real money at sale. He never named Rilla. He did not have to. There were only 2 heirloom growers left in the pool, and the other one was 81. The co-op voted to set a minimum varietal standard. In plain terms, they voted her wheat out of the pool. She found out by letter. Most people getting that letter would have folded. The pool was how a small dryland operation got grain to market without a truck and a contract and a buyer of her own. Without it, she was a woman with 800 acres of unwanted wheat and no door to sell it through. Her daughter, Junie, who was 24 that year and had a 2-year degree in agribusiness and a head full of exactly the arithmetic. Maddox preached, sat at the kitchen table, and said the thing out loud that the whole county was thinking. "Mom, he's not wrong about the yield. 30 bushels against 50. That's a third of our income we're choosing to leave in the ground every single year for seed nobody will even buy." Rilla turned the coffee can a quarter turn on the windowsill, the way she did when she was deciding how much to say. "Wait for a dry year," she said. "You keep saying that." Junie's voice cracked at the edge. Not from anger, from fear. The particular fear of a young person who can see the numbers and cannot see why her mother won't. What if it doesn't come? What if it just never comes and we're broke and the seed's still in a can? "Then I was wrong," Rilla said. "And you'll know it, and you can plant whatever you want. But it'll come. This country always collects." What she did instead of folding was the part the spreadsheet could not predict. She built her own door. If the co-op would not take her wheat as a commodity, she would sell it as something the commodity market did not have a column for. She ground 100 pounds of it on a stone mill she bought used off a man in Pueblo, sacked the flour into 10-pound bags with no label on them at all, and drove 4 hours to Denver with the bags on the seat beside her. She walked into the back kitchens of 3 bakeries that had begun in those years to advertise bread made from heritage grain milled fresh, and she put a sack on the steel counter and did not make a speech, because she said, "Bake with it and call me if you taste anything." 2 of the 3 called within the week. Turkey Red has a flavor the modern hybrids bred out along with everything else. A nutty depth and a slow ferment that an artisan baker will pay for because his customers can taste it, and the supermarket loaf cannot fake it. The third baker, a man named Soren, who ran a place near the rail yards and shaped every loaf by hand, did not call. He drove out to Kestrel County instead, 300 miles, and stood in her field with a piece of her bread in his coat pocket and asked to see where the flour had come from. He crumbled a head of the wheat in his palm the way she did, smelled it, and said he had been buying commodity flour his whole career and had not known until that week that flour could have a place it came from, the way wine did. She came home from that field walk with a handshake. He agreed to buy every clean bushel she could mill, at nearly triple the commodity price, on one condition. The wheat had to be a single identifiable variety, traceable from her field to his oven, because that was the whole story he meant to sell. That condition turned out to matter more than either of them knew. To make it work, she needed her seed certified, registered with the state as a recognized variety, so that a buyer could trust the bag said what the field grew. She applied. And that was when Kurt Maddox, who was a thorough man, did the thing that turned an honest disagreement into a fight. He filed a complaint with the State Crop Improvement Board challenging the purity of her seed line. It was not a frivolous complaint, and that is what made it dangerous. He argued with photographs of her mixed-height field that her wheat was not a uniform certifiable variety at all, but a genetic mongrel, an uncontrolled population that could not meet the purity standard the certification required, and that to register it would be to put the state stamp on a bag of mystery. By the letter of the certification rules, written for uniform modern varieties, he had a point. A landrace is the opposite of uniform. That is the whole idea of a landrace. The rules had simply never been written with one in mind. Her application was suspended pending review. The baker, who could not buy uncertified grain and could not sell bread he could not trace, had to put their handshake on hold. And Maddox, who genuinely believed he was protecting buyers from fraud, had, with a single signature, closed both of her doors at once. She was, in the spring of 2014, a woman with 800 acres of heritage wheat, no pool, no certificate, no buyer, and a daughter who had stopped saying anything at the kitchen table at all. Here is where most tellings would have her get lucky. She does not get lucky. She gets to work, and she gets help. And the help comes from the one direction Maddox never thought to defend. The certification rules had a clause, buried and almost never used, for what they called a heritage population variety, a category written decades earlier for exactly the kind of seed Rilla had, and then forgotten because nobody grew such things anymore. To qualify under it, a grower could not simply assert that her wheat was a stable old landrace. She had to prove it. She had to document the line's provenance, its continuity, its identity over time, and she had to grow out a certified increase plot under the eye of an inspector across 3 seasons to show that the population, mixed as it was, bred true to itself year over year and did not drift. 3 seasons. The very dry years she had been waiting for, she now had to survive in order to be allowed to sell into them. She found the clause because of an old woman named Ode Pencow, who had run the county elevator at Sorrel Buttes for 31 years before she retired, and who remembered, dimly at first and then sharply, that her own father had registered a heritage oat under that same clause back in 1961. Ode was the one who pulled the original rulebook out of a box in her garage and put her finger on the paragraph. She did it at her own kitchen table with her reading glasses pushed up her nose, and when she found it, she tapped the page twice. "There," Ode said. "That's the door he didn't lock. He locked the front. This one's around back." To document the provenance, Rilla needed the chain of the seed proven across the generations, and the chain was not on paper. It was in the coffee can, in the practice itself, in the unbroken handing down. So she built the paper. She spent the better part of a winter at the kitchen table after the stock was fed, the lamp pulled close, going through trunks and cardboard boxes that had not been opened since her grandmother died. She found the threshing records first, a stack of pocket ledgers held with a rubber band that crumbled when she touched it, the cleaned-out date and weight of every saved portion in her grandmother's tight pencil hand, going back to 1948, and her great-grandmother's looser hand, before that running back into pages too faded to read. She found a letter from 1952 in which a county agent, irritated, advised her grandmother in 2 paragraphs to give up the old wheat and plant a modern variety the state was promoting, and underneath the agent's signature in pencil, her grandmother's reply that she never mailed, the same 4 words Rilla had grown up hearing. She sat with that letter a long time. She found the last piece in a place she had walked past her whole life. Inside her great-grandmother's Bible, pressed flat in wax paper between the pages of the Book of Ruth, was a small fold of original seed, 24 kernels carried off a train in 1909 and saved out by a woman who could not have known anyone would ever need to prove they were real. Rilla mailed 8 of those kernels to a state seed lab, along with a sample cut from her own field that summer. The lab ran the genetics and reported back that the 2 were continuous, the same line. The field, 104 years, descended from the wax paper with no break and no substitution anywhere along the way. The chain that had lived only in a practice now lived on a page she could hand across a desk. She could prove it grain by grain. If you have ever kept a thing alive only because someone you loved asked you to, with no proof it would ever matter, and every sensible voice telling you to let it go, you already understand the part of this that no certificate could measure. Stay with that feeling for a moment. Then watch what the weather did with it. To document the continuity going forward, she planted the certified increase plot, 40 acres, fenced and flagged, and she let the state inspector walk it 3 years running. And here is where the story turns, because the second of those 3 years was 2014, and the third was 2015. And the heat that everyone in that country had been waiting for and dreading finally came. It did not come as a single dramatic storm. Drought never does. It came as an absence. The snowpack in the mountains to the west ran 60% of normal that winter, and the spring rains simply did not arrive, and by the middle of May the dryland country, north of Sorrel Buttes, was already cracking, the soil pulling apart into a mosaic of hard plates with seams a person could lose a quarter down. The forecast for July called for a ridge of high pressure to park over the Central Plains and not move, which, in plain language, meant weeks of 100-degree days and dry wind out of the southwest. The exact weather that finishes a wheat crop before its time. Curt Maddox was not idle in those years. Understand that. He was not a man who fired one shot and waited. As the certification review dragged on, he doubled down, because he believed. He planted demonstration strips of Prairie Gold 9 along the county road where everyone could see them, the tall uniform stand heading out early and clean, and he hosted a field day at the co-op in June of 2015, where he stood between the rows and made his case to 40 farmers with a yield monitor printout in his hand. He spoke well, he spoke fairly, he even spoke kindly about Rilla, said she was a fine grower with a misplaced loyalty, and that loyalty to the past was a luxury a dryland farmer could not afford. The thing he did that day, the active and deliberate thing, was to time his demonstration to the moment his hybrid looked best, and her wheat looked worst. The dry early summer when the early heading hybrid had already filled its grain and the slow old landrace was still green and weeks from ripe. He wanted the county to see her field looking behind, and it did. The field day drew 40 trucks. Maddox had a folding table set up at the end of his demonstration strip, with a coffee urn and a stack of printouts, and he walked the row with the farmers in 2s and 3s, kneeling to pull a head of Prairie Gold 9 and break it open in his palm so they could see the plump even kernels packed tight down both sides. He was generous with it. He answered every question straight, gave credit to the wet spring, did not oversell. That was the thing about him that made him hard to dislike and harder to dismiss. He told them the truth as far as he could see it, and he could see it a long way in a normal year. He gestured once, without unkindness, toward the green, uneven smudge of Rilla's wheat, visible a mile off across the section line, still weeks from ripe, and he said only that some folks were farming for a year that wasn't coming. The men nodded. It was the easiest thing in the world to nod at, standing in a wet June. Junie went to that field day. She came home and stood in the kitchen doorway and did not sit down. Everybody was there, she said. And his wheat's already made. Ours is still green. Mom, it's still green, and it's 101 out, and there's no rain till maybe September. They're already calling it. Maddox stood there and called it. Rilla was at the sink. She did not turn around right away. What did he say? The heads ran. She asked. His. What number did he put on the board? 52. 52 bushels projected. On the strips by the road. On the strips by the road, she said, where he watered the headland in. Did anybody walk to the middle of the section? Junie didn't answer because nobody had. Let me tell you what happened in July, because this is the part the new wheat was not built for. The ridge of high pressure came, and it parked exactly as forecast, and it did not move for 19 days. The temperature reached 104 on the 11th of July and stayed in the high 90s and low hundreds for 2.5 weeks, with a wind out of the southwest that never let up and never carried a cloud. And the early heading hybrid, which had filled its grain in the cool of June and looked so far ahead at the field day, had filled it shallow. Prairie Gold 9 was bred to head early and finish fast, and in a normal year, that was its genius. It set all its grain at once on a single timetable, and it had set that grain on the strength of a wet spring that wrote a check the summer could not cash. The plants were tall and uniform and stood in straight, unbroken rows, and inside the heads the kernels had shriveled in the heat to half their weight, pinched and light, a condition the old men called tip back, and the test weight gauge called catastrophe. The whole county had bet on a single plant with a single strategy, and the single strategy met the one summer it could not handle. It failed all at once across 40,000 acres, because that is what uniformity does. It does not fail a little, it fails together. Rilla's field did not look better. That is the thing nobody expected, and the thing that is true. In the worst of the heat, her wheat looked terrible, too, ragged and uneven and burned at the edges. Uneven, though, was the whole point. The landrace had not headed out all at once. Its committee of slightly different plants had headed across a 3-week spread, some early and caught by the heat like the hybrid, but many late, their grain still in the milk stage when the worst of the ridge broke on the 29th of July and a band of thunderstorms finally came up off the mountains and dropped 1 1/10 inches of rain in a single night. The early heads were lost. The late heads, watered at the one moment that could still save them, filled out heavy and sound, and the deep roots of the old wheat, which the modern breeders had shortened to feed grain instead of digging, had gone down past the cracked plates to moisture the hybrid shallow roots never reached. The morning the combine first went into the hybrid ground, you could hear the loss before you could see it. A healthy crop runs heavy through the threshing drum with a low, full sound. The Prairie Gold 9 ran light and fast and high, the straw all chaff and the hopper filling slow, and the men running the machines knew within the first round what they had. Test weight is the measure of how much a bushel of grain weighs, and milling wheat wants 60 pounds to the bushel and will be docked below 58. The hybrid came off the field that year at 51, 52, some of it 49 kernels, so shriveled the cleaning fan blew half of them out the back as trash. A man named Hollis, who farmed the section next to Rilla's, sat in his truck at the edge of his own field for the better part of an afternoon and did not run the combine at all, because he had run the numbers in his head and the diesel to harvest it cost more than the wheat would bring. Rilla's field did not make 52 bushels, she made 26. On dryland ground, in the worst drought in 40 years, her unwanted heirloom wheat made 26 bushels to the acre, and it came off the field at 61 pounds, heavy and sound, the late heads carrying the early ones. Prairie Gold 9, across the rest of Kestrel County, made 9 bushels, and most of that too light and shriveled to sell as milling wheat at all, dumped into the feed market for a fraction of $1. The county that had voted her seed out of the pool brought in a crop it could barely give away. Maddox's demonstration, strips by the road, the ones he had watered the headland on, came in better than the rest, because of that water, and even they finished under 20. The middle of those same sections, where no one had walked, made 7. You can put the whole thing in a sentence. In the year the model was built to win, The model made 9 bushels, and the wheat nobody wanted made 26. And 26 bushels of a certified traceable heritage variety at 3 times the commodity price is not a number you can set beside 9 bushels of feed wheat at the commodity floor. They are not the same product, and they never were. And that was the part Kurt Maddox's spreadsheet had no column for. Because in the autumn of 2015, while the county was still tallying its losses, the State Crop Improvement Board concluded its 3-year review of her increased plot, and the inspector who had walked it through the very drought everyone said would finish it, certified her finding. Her wheat had bred, true to itself, across the worst 3 seasons in living memory. It had not drifted. It was, by the letter of the long-forgotten clause, a registered heritage population variety, the first one approved in that state in 54 years. The certificate came in the mail on a Tuesday. Rilla read it standing at the counter, set it next to the coffee can, and went out to do chores. Soren the baker took every clean bushel as he had promised at the price they had shaken on 3 years before. And because hers was now the only certified heritage hard red winter wheat for 400 miles, and because the drought had made the whole country suddenly curious about which wheats survive a dry year and which do not, the demand did not stop at one bakery. A miller in Fort Collins called. Then a grain buyer who supplied a string of bakeries across the Front Range called. Then, the following spring, the Agricultural Extension Service of the very land-grant university that had trained Kurt Maddox called, asking whether they might purchase foundation seed from Rilla Hawkins to begin a drought resilience trial because somebody in the department had pulled the 2015 yield maps and noticed a single anomalous field north of Sorrel Buttes that had made 26, when everything around it made 9. Let me tell you about the day Kurt Maddox came back to the field. It was June again, 3 years to the month from the first time, in 2016, and the wheat behind her was heading out in its ragged, uneven committee, some heads early and some still green, and he stood at the same field edge, with no tablet under his arm this time, and no truck idling on the road, because he had driven out alone, and parked and walked in. He was not flushed, and he was not shouting. The men who tell these stories like to put a red face and a pointing finger on the doubter at the end, and that is not how it went. And he had spent the winter going over the yield data the way an honest man goes over a thing that has broken his model, looking for the error and not finding one, and arriving slowly at the place that is harder than anger. He said he had been wrong about the number. He said it plainly, the way he had once delivered the diagnosis, except now the certainty had gone out of his voice, and something more careful had come into it. He said he had built his whole case on average years, and that he had never once, in 30 years of trusting the model, accounted for the year that is not average, the year the average is made of. He said he understood now that he had been measuring the wrong thing. He had measured yield in the years you expect, and her grandmother had been measuring survival in the years you do not. Rilla let him finish. She did not say she had told him so, because she had not once in 4 years, and she was not going to start now. She had only ever said 5 words to him, the same 5, and they had already come true. What she said instead was a question, and it was the question of a person who had won and did not want the winning to be the end of him. "You know how to read a yield map better than anybody in this county," she said. "You want to learn how to read a field." He stayed the whole morning. She walked him out into the middle of the section, the part no one had walked at his field day, and she knelt with a tile spade and dug down beside a single plant until she reached the root and could lift it whole, and she held it up so he could see how far the root went past where his fingers reached. Well, down into the cracked subsoil where his hybrid had never been bred to follow. The root was the part the breeders had shortened on purpose, she told him, because every inch a plant spends going down is an inch of grain it does not put up top. And in a wet year, that trade made sense, and the new wheat was right to take it. She showed him the spread of the heading next, walked him 20 steps, and pointed out a head, already gold beside a head still soft and green, and another, the early and the late standing shoulder to shoulder all across the field. She explained the committee the way her grandmother had explained it to her at the kitchen table with a pan of kernels between them, that a landrace never all dies on the same day, that its whole genius is its refusal to agree on a single plan. She let him hold a head of it and rub the grain out into his palm and feel the weight of a kernel that had filled in a year that gave it nothing. He was quiet a long time, a man with a master's degree learning something his degree had been built to overlook. And when he finally spoke, he asked a question instead of making a statement, which she took as the better sign of the two. He asked her how many of these slight differences a person had to keep the insurance working. She told him she did not know the number, and neither had her grandmother. That you did not keep them by counting them. You kept them by saving the heavy heads every single year and never letting the field get talked into agreeing with itself. He wrote nothing down. She noticed that and respected it. A man who writes it down is filing it. A man who stands there with his hands going cold around a head of someone else's wheat is learning it. The university trial went forward with foundation seed from her coffee can grown out under a number instead of a name, and the data from it would, over the next several years, begin to nudge the long uniform world of dryland wheat breeding back toward something it had abandoned, toward diversity inside the field as insurance against the years that do not behave. Kurt Maddox left Vanter Seed within 2 years and went back to the extension service he had started in. And one of the first things he did there was rewrite the variety certification guidance to make the heritage population clause findable. So the next grower who came along with a coffee can and 100 years of provenance would not have to be told by a retired elevator manager that there was a door, around back. Junie took over the seed side of the operation and built it into a business that sold registered turkey red foundation seed to 200 growers across 4 states by the end of the decade, every bag of it traceable to one field north of Sorrel Buttes. She had been the skeptic at the kitchen table, the one who could see the numbers and not the reason, and she became the one who carried the reason forward, which is its own kind of vindication and maybe the truest kind. The co-op that had voted Rilla's wheat out of the pool quietly amended its bylaws in 2017 to create a separate heritage grain marketing pool and asked her to anchor it. The vote to do it was nearly unanimous, and several of the men who raised their hands for it were the same men who had raised their hands 4 years earlier to vote her out, and not one of them met her eye while they did it, and she let them keep that small mercy and said nothing about the first vote at all. Ode Pankow came out of retirement for 2 days a week to keep the books on the new pool, because she said somebody ought to who remembered why it existed. The neighbor named Hollis, the one who had sat in his truck, unable to afford his own harvest, was the second grower to sign on, and he came to Rilla's place to ask for seed wheat with his hat in his hand, and she filled his drill box from her own bin and told him to save back his heavy heads in the fall and pay it forward to the next man who came. Asking, she said yes to anchoring the pool, and she held no grudge that anyone could find, and people looked for it the way people will. There was nothing to find. She had not been farming against Kurt Maddox or against Vantor Seed or against the county. She had been farming for the coffee can, and the coffee can had come through, And that was all the argument she had ever intended to make. There were two kinds of knowing underneath every part of this, and it is worth saying plainly which was which. There is a wide, fast, confident kind of knowing that measures what can be measured and trusts the average. And in the years that behave, it is right. And it builds tall uniform fields that make 50 bushels and stand straight for the combine. Kurt Maddox carried that kind, and he carried it in good faith, and most years it would have made him right and her foolish. And there is a narrow, slow, patient kind of knowing that lives in one piece of ground across 100 years and does not trust the average because it has buried too many of the years the average is made of. It keeps the committee. It saves the heaviest heads into a coffee can. It cannot tell you what next year's yield will be, and it does not try. Wah, bah. It only knows that the dry year always comes eventually, because this country always collects, and that the thing built to win every ordinary season is the thing most certain to break in the one season that matters. The first kind of knowing measures the world. The second kind belongs to it. Rilla farmed that ground another 14 years and handed it to her daughters still alive, the seed and the land both, which had been the only job all along. The coffee can sits on the same windowsill it always sat on, a little more dented, the lid pressed down by the same hand-cleaned weight of heritage wheat her grandmother saved through the dust years, and her great-grandmother carried off a train into a country nobody else wanted. On a dry evening in late June, with the light coming low and amber across a field of ragged, uneven wheat that has no business looking as good as it does, you can stand at the edge of that section the way the agronomist once stood, and you can see the early heads gone gold and the late heads still green among them. All the slight differences her grandmother spent, a lifetime protecting, the whole patient committee of it, leaning a little in the southwest wind, that finishes lesser wheat and cannot finish this. It is not the most wheat. It was never going to be the most wheat. It is the wheat that is still here,